The most expensive mistake my HOA president ever made wasn't tearing down my ranch fence. It was assuming she knew what that fence was actually holding back. At exactly 7:12 on a Saturday morning, 18 full-grown cattle were standing on the signature green of Willow Creek Golf Club. One was chewing on a tournament flag. Another was ankle-deep in a sand bunker that cost more to maintain each year than my first pickup truck. Golf carts sat abandoned across the fairway. Groundskeepers were shouting into radios. Somewhere in the distance, a sprinkler system hissed uselessly against the scene that looked less like a country club and more like a ranch relocation project gone completely sideways. And right in the middle of all that chaos stood Deborah Harrington, president of the Willow Creek HOA. Her white visor was crooked. Her designer sunglasses were hanging halfway off her face. She was yelling into her phone while pointing at my cattle like they had personally declared war on her neighborhood. The funny thing was, none of this would have happened if she had simply left my fence alone. The morning air smelled like fresh-cut grass, wet soil, and expensive panic. I stood quietly near the maintenance entrance with a cup of black coffee warming my hands and watched 18 animals enjoy the most expensive breakfast buffet in the county. What Deborah didn't know yet was that every minute of this disaster had already been recorded, documented, and traced back to one decision. Her decision. 3 days earlier, she had celebrated what she called a major victory for the community. She had even posted photos online, smiling beside a freshly cleared property line, congratulating herself for removing what she described as an unnecessary visual obstruction. The obstruction she was talking about happened to be my ranch fence. The same fence my father maintained before me. The same fence my grandfather built more than 30 years ago. The same fence responsible for keeping 18 curious cattle exactly where they belong. But standing there that morning, watching HOA board members sprint across a golf course trying to outsmart livestock, I realized something important. People like Deborah never think beyond the immediate victory. They see an obstacle and remove it. They never stop to ask why it exists. A loudspeaker crackled somewhere near the clubhouse. Tournament delayed. Please remain calm. That announcement was immediately followed by the sight of one of my largest steers wandering directly across the tee box while several golfers watched in stunned silence. I nearly laughed into my coffee. Nearly. Because despite how ridiculous the scene looked, this story wasn't really about cattle. It was about power. It was about arrogance. And it was about what happens when someone becomes so obsessed with controlling everyone around them that they stop respecting boundaries. Legal boundaries. Property boundaries. Common sense boundaries. My name is Ethan Walker. I'm 44 years old, third-generation rancher, and owner of the last working cattle ranch bordering Willow Creek Estates. 3 days before 18 cattle discovered the HOA's golf course, Deborah Harrington decided my fence was ruining her view. That decision was about to cost her more than she could possibly imagine. The ranch sits on 120 acres of rolling Colorado grassland where the wind never seems to stop moving. On quiet mornings, you can hear it brushing through the pasture before the sun even clears the hills. That sound has been part of my life for as long as I can remember. My grandfather bought this land after returning home from military service. My father expanded it one fence post, one water line, and one stubborn acre at a time. By the time it reached me, the ranch was more than property. It was family history written directly into the soil. Every gate had a story. Every trail carried memories. Even the old fence along the eastern boundary had been standing longer than some of the houses inside Willow Creek Estates. The smell of hay and fresh earth still reminds me of summer mornings when my father would wake me before sunrise and hand me a pair of work gloves that were always one size too big. He used to tell me that fences were not built because neighbors hated each other. They were built because good boundaries kept everyone happy. At the time, I thought he was talking about cattle. Years later, I realized he was talking about people. The 18 cattle everyone saw wandering across that golf course were not random livestock. They were breeding stock. Some of the most valuable animals I owned. Calm, healthy, predictable animals that spend nearly every day following the same routine. They knew their pasture. They knew their water source. They knew exactly where they belong. Which is why what happened later should never have happened at all. For years, my relationship with Willow Creek Estates had been simple. I stayed on my side of the property line. They stayed on theirs. Most of the residents were decent people. Some waved when they drove past. A few even bought fresh beef from me every year. The problem started after Deborah Harrington became HOA President. Suddenly every conversation became about appearances. Every decision became about image. Every discussion somehow led back to property values. Deborah treated the neighborhood like a private kingdom wrapped in decorative landscaping and golf memberships. She drove a white luxury sport utility vehicle that always looked freshly detailed. She wore expensive golf clothes even when she was not golfing. And she had a habit of smiling while delivering demands that sounded suspiciously like orders. The first time we met, she stood near the fence line with her arms crossed and stared out across my pasture. I remember the smell of freshly cut grass drifting over from the golf course as she shook her head. She said the ranch created an unfortunate visual contrast for the community. I actually laughed because I thought she was joking. She was not. Over the next year, that fence seemed to become an obsession. She mentioned it during HOA meetings. She complained about it during community events. She even brought visitors out to look at it as if it were some kind of historical nuisance. The strange part was that the fence was entirely on my property. Survey markers proved it. County records proved it. Every legal document imaginable proved it. Yet Deborah continued acting like she had authority over something she did not own. Looking back now, standing there with a coffee cup while cattle explored the most expensive grass in the county, I should have recognized the warning signs sooner. Because people who believe rules only apply to others rarely stop with complaints. Eventually, they convince themselves they have the right to act. And Deborah Harrington was getting very close to that point. The complaints started small enough that I almost ignored them. An email about maintaining community aesthetics. A letter about preserving neighborhood harmony. A brochure left in my mailbox showing artists' renderings of future improvements around Willow Creek Estates. Every one of them somehow included photographs taken suspiciously close to my property line. At first, I assumed Deborah was just another HOA president looking for a project to justify her position. Then I attended one of the public meetings. The clubhouse smelled like coffee, printer toner, and fresh carpet cleaner. Ceiling fans hummed overhead while residents settled into folding chairs. I sat quietly in the back, listening. Deborah stood at the front of the room beside a large presentation board covered with maps and photographs. When my ranch appeared on the screen, several people turned around to look at me. Deborah smiled. It was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. She began talking about modernization, community image, long-term property appreciation. Then she pointed directly at the eastern boundary of my ranch. According to her, the fence created a visual barrier between the neighborhood and the natural beauty beyond it. I remember raising an eyebrow because the natural beauty beyond it was my pasture. She spoke as if the land existed for everyone except the person who actually owned it. After the meeting, several residents approached me privately. Most seemed embarrassed. One retired firefighter shook his head and told me he thought the whole thing was ridiculous. Another neighbor quietly apologized for comments she said had been made behind closed doors. Apparently Deborah had spent months convincing certain board members that removing the fence would improve views from the golf course and increase property values throughout the subdivision. The logic made no sense, but that never seemed to slow her down. Over the following months, the pressure increased. Survey requests began appearing. Questions about easements. Requests for access. Suggestions that I voluntarily relocate sections of the fence to create a more open appearance. Every proposal somehow benefited Willow Creek and cost me money. Every conversation ended the same way. I politely declined. The more I refused, the more determined Deborah became. She started showing up near the property line with architects, consultants, and landscaping contractors. Sometimes I would spot them through the pasture while feeding cattle. They would stand there pointing toward the fence as if discussing a future project that had already been approved. One afternoon I drove out to inspect a water trough and found Deborah speaking with a golf course manager near the eastern boundary. The smell of cut grass drifted across the fairway while sprinklers clicked rhythmically in the distance. She immediately switched to her practiced smile when she saw me approaching. She explained they were simply exploring possibilities for future beautification efforts. I asked whether those possibilities involved property she did not own. Her smile disappeared for half a second before returning even brighter than before. That was the moment I realized this was no longer about appearance. This was about control. Deborah could not stand hearing the word no. Every time I enforced a perfectly legal boundary, she treated it like a personal insult. Every survey marker, every property record, every county map only seemed to frustrate her further. The fence had become more than wood and wire. In her mind, it was evidence that there was still something inside Willow Creek she could not control. Looking back, the warning signs were obvious. Normal people accept boundaries when the facts are clear. Deborah responded by escalating. And the closer she moved toward that fence, the closer she moved toward a mistake that would eventually leave 18 very curious cattle wandering exactly where they were never supposed to be. The situation reached a new level the day Deborah decided. Facts were no longer enough and started trying to manufacture her own version of reality. About 6 weeks before the golf course incident, I came home from a livestock auction and found bright orange survey flags scattered along the eastern edge of my property. They fluttered in the afternoon breeze like someone had marked a future construction site. The smell of dust and sun-baked grass hung in the air as I walked the fence line, pulling one flag after another from the ground. None of them matched the actual property markers. Not even close. I called the county survey office the next morning. They confirmed no new survey had been authorized. That answer did not surprise me. What surprised me was how bold Deborah was becoming. A few days later, I received a formal letter from the HOA. According to the document, newly reviewed measurements suggested the fence might be encroaching on community property. The wording was careful, full of phrases like possible discrepancies and pending verification. But the message was obvious. They wanted me to move the fence. I hired a licensed surveyor immediately. A week later, he spent an entire day reviewing deeds, markers, historical records, and county maps. The result was exactly what I expected. The fence sat entirely on my land. In several places it was actually set back a few feet from the legal boundary. The survey report could not have been clearer if it had been written with a neon marker. I thought that would finally end the discussion. Instead, it seemed to make Deborah angry. During the next HOA meeting, she reportedly questioned the survey results in front of residents. Then she suggested additional reviews. Then independent consultations. Then legal evaluations. Every time evidence contradicted her claims, she simply moved the argument somewhere else. It was like watching someone lose a chess match and respond by changing the rules of chess. The pressure continued building. Golf course managers began appearing near the property line more frequently. Landscaping crews measured sections of land they did not own. One afternoon I spotted a contractor photographing the fence from multiple angles. Another day I found tire tracks running parallel to the boundary where maintenance vehicles had been driving unusually close. None of it was technically illegal. Not yet. But it created a constant feeling that someone was testing limits. The strange part was how personal Deborah seemed to take every setback. Normal people move on when proven wrong. Deborah doubled down. The more official records supported me, the more determined she became to find another path around them. One evening, just before sunset, I saw her standing beside the 8th fairway looking directly toward the ranch. The sky glowed orange behind the hills. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across the course. She stood there for several minutes with 2 board members, pointing toward the fence and speaking animatedly. I could not hear the conversation, but I did not need to. Their body language said enough. They were planning something. That feeling stayed with me during the following days. The air itself seemed tense. The calls stopped. The letters stopped. The complaints stopped. For the first time in months, everything became quiet. And that silence bothered me more than the arguments ever had. Because in my experience, people who suddenly stop pushing are rarely giving up. More often, they are simply preparing their next move. Standing on the golf course weeks later, watching HOA board members scramble between fairways and sand traps, I would remember that silence very clearly. It turned out Deborah had not accepted defeat after all. She had simply decided to stop asking permission. The night everything changed started out surprisingly ordinary. A cool breeze moved across the pasture after sunset, carrying the smell of dry grass and distant rain. The cattle had been fed. The gates were secured. The ranch settled into the familiar quiet that comes after a long day of work. Around 10:30 that evening, I finished paperwork at the kitchen table and checked the security cameras before heading to bed. Nothing unusual. Just empty fence lines, dark fields, and the occasional reflection from a passing vehicle on the county road. Sometime after midnight, a notification appeared on my phone. One of the motion sensors along the eastern boundary had activated. At first I assumed it was wildlife. Deer triggered the cameras all the time. But when I opened the live feed, I immediately sat up. Headlights. Multiple vehicles. The grainy black and white image showed trucks parked near the property line. Several people moved back and forth carrying equipment. The air conditioning hummed softly inside the house while I stared at the screen trying to process what I was seeing. Then one of the cameras captured a clear view of a contractor vehicle. Another camera showed workers gathering near the fence. My stomach tightened. I threw on a jacket and drove toward the eastern pasture. By the time I arrived, the vehicles were already leaving. The smell of diesel lingered in the night air. Fresh tire tracks cut through the dirt near the boundary. My headlights swept across the fence line and immediately revealed the damage. Hundreds of feet of fencing were gone. Fence posts that had stood there for decades had been removed. Sections of wire lay piled beside the pasture. In their place stood temporary markers and construction stakes. I stepped out of the truck into complete silence. The only sound was the wind moving through the grass. For a moment I simply stared. Not because I was shocked. Because I was amazed someone had actually gone through with it. After months of complaints, meetings, surveys, and arguments, Deborah had apparently decided that ownership was just a technicality. I walked the entire damaged section with a flashlight. The beam reflected off fresh cuts and disturbed soil. Everything looked recent. Everything looked deliberate. Then I noticed something else. One of the security cameras mounted on a nearby pole had captured the entire area. The small indicator light blinked steadily in the darkness. Recording. Still recording. Back at the house, I reviewed the footage. Vehicle after vehicle entered the area shortly after midnight. Contractors unloaded equipment. Workers removed sections of fence. Supervisors walked the line pointing towards specific locations. And near the beginning of the recording, illuminated by truck headlights, stood Deborah Harrington herself. She was not hiding. She was not sneaking around. She looked confident. Comfortable. Certain she was finally getting her way. Most people would have been furious watching that video. Strangely, I was calm. The evidence was clear. The property records were clear. The survey reports were clear. Deborah had spent months trying to move a boundary that did not belong to her, and now she had crossed a line that county records would not ignore. I copied every file to multiple drives. I documented the damage. I called my attorney first thing the next morning. Then I did something that surprised everyone. I did not rush into court. I did not call the news. I did not confront Deborah. Instead, I checked every gate, inspected every animal, and quietly continued my routine. Because while Deborah believed she had finally removed an obstacle, she still did not understand what that fence actually did. And that misunderstanding was about to become very expensive. The reaction from Willow Creek was almost more interesting than the fence itself. By the second day, word had spread through the neighborhood that I had not filed an emergency lawsuit, had not called reporters, and had not shown up at the HOA office demanding answers. Residents kept waiting for a confrontation that never came. The smell of fresh rain lingered over the ranch that week as dark clouds rolled across the hills each afternoon. I spent my mornings exactly the same way I always did. Feeding cattle. Checking water lines. Inspecting gates. Repairing equipment. From the outside, it probably looked like I was doing nothing at all. That illusion turned out to be useful. Deborah clearly expected a fight. She seemed almost disappointed when one never arrived. Instead of hearing from my attorney, she heard nothing. Instead of court papers, she saw me driving a tractor through the pasture like it was any other week. The silence made her confident. Confident people make mistakes. On the third day after the fence disappeared, I received an email from the HOA informing me that landscape enhancement work along the boundary would begin soon. The message thanked residents for supporting improvements designed to increase community enjoyment and property values. I read it twice and actually laughed. They were already talking about improvements to land they did not own. That afternoon, I met with my attorney. The office smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and old wood furniture. We reviewed the footage together. Every vehicle. Every contractor. Every timestamp. Every angle. The evidence was overwhelming. My attorney asked when I wanted to file. I surprised him with a simple answer. Not yet. He looked at me for several seconds before nodding slowly. He understood. The legal case was not going anywhere. The evidence was preserved. The property records were preserved. There was no rush. Back at the ranch, I focused on something else. The cattle. Specifically, the 18 breeding animals housed in the eastern pasture. They were creatures of habit. Every rancher understands that. They followed familiar routes. They grazed predictable areas. They moved toward water, shelter, and open paths. Remove one element from their environment, and eventually they would begin exploring places they normally ignored. That was not misbehavior. That was simply animal behavior. Which made one detail especially important. The section of fence Deborah removed happened to sit closest to the golf course. Meanwhile, life inside Willow Creek continued as if victory had already been secured. New landscaping materials appeared near the boundary. Workers began marking future decorative areas. Residents posted photographs of the improved view online. One HOA board member even described the change as a major step toward modernizing the community. Every celebration felt strangely premature. They were admiring the absence of something without understanding its purpose. Late one afternoon, I drove along the eastern pasture while checking mineral feeders. The sky had turned dark gray. Wind pushed across the grass in steady waves. In the distance, I could see golfers finishing their rounds while maintenance crews prepared for incoming weather. A storm was building. Nothing severe. Just enough wind and rain to change conditions. I remember sitting in my truck listening to the first drops strike the windshield. The air smelled like wet soil and ozone. Out across the pasture, several cattle lifted their heads toward the approaching weather. Then they slowly turned and began moving together. Watching them, a thought crossed my mind. Boundaries are funny things. Most people only notice them after they are gone. Deborah spent months treating that fence like an inconvenience. A visual annoyance. An obstacle standing between her community and a prettier view. What she failed to understand was that the fence had never been the problem. The fence had been the solution. And with the storm approaching, the consequences of removing that solution were getting closer by the hour. The storm arrived just after midnight. Not the kind that makes headlines, just a steady Colorado rain driven by strong wind. I woke several times listening to gusts rattle the windows of the ranch house. By dawn, low clouds hung over the pasture, and everything smelled like wet earth and fresh grass. I grabbed a rain jacket, poured a cup of coffee, and headed outside to check the property. The eastern pasture was the first stop. Water collected in shallow depressions across the field. The remaining fence sections held firm, but the area Deborah had cleared looked worse than before. Rain had softened the soil. Several temporary stakes leaned at odd angles. The open gaps seemed even larger now. I counted cattle automatically as I always did. One group near the water tank. Another near the tree line. Then I stopped. Something felt wrong. I counted again. 17. My stomach tightened. I counted a third time. Still 17. One animal was missing. Then movement caught my eye farther east. Several heads appeared through the morning mist. Not one animal. Multiple animals. They were walking calmly toward the opening where the fence used to be. I immediately climbed into my truck and headed across the pasture. By the time I reached the area, the situation had already changed. The first cattle had crossed through the gap. Others followed. There was no panic. No stampede. Just 18 curious animals exploring a route that had never existed before. Beyond that opening sat perfectly maintained grass, decorative landscaping, small ponds, and acres of golf course. To a cow, it probably looked like paradise. I contacted a ranch hand and started organizing recovery plans immediately. Even then, I knew exactly what would happen next. Cattle are attracted to open space, fresh grass, and easy movement. Willow Creek had unintentionally created the perfect invitation. Less than 30 minutes later, my phone started vibrating. Then it rang again. And again. Text messages flooded in from neighbors. Photographs started appearing. Someone had spotted cattle near the third fairway. Another resident reported seeing several near a decorative pond. A golfer posted a blurry image showing two animals standing beside a golf cart path. With every new message, the situation expanded. The most ironic part was how peaceful everything looked. The cattle were not causing chaos. They were simply wandering through areas they had never been able to access before. The chaos came from the humans. By 8 o'clock that morning, HOA board members were racing around the property trying to figure out what had happened. Maintenance staff drove from hole to hole. Residents gathered near sidewalks pointing toward distant fairways. Phones appeared everywhere. Photos. Videos. Social media posts. Meanwhile, I continued coordinating a safe recovery effort while documenting everything. Then one image arrived that made me set down my coffee and stare at the screen. Deborah Harrington stood near the clubhouse entrance surrounded by several board members. Her expression looked completely different from the confident smile she wore during HOA meetings. Behind her, visible across a stretch of perfectly maintained grass, stood several members of my herd enjoying the most expensive landscaping in the county. At that exact moment, I realized the story was about to become much bigger than a missing fence. Because for the first time, the consequences of Deborah's decision were no longer theoretical. They were standing in plain sight where the entire community could see them. By mid-morning, Willow Creek looked like a community experiencing a public relations nightmare in real time. The annual charity golf tournament had been scheduled for that weekend, and participants were already arriving when photographs of the cattle began spreading through neighborhood group chats. Luxury vehicles filled the clubhouse parking lot. Volunteers hurried between registration tables. Local sponsors had banners displayed near the entrance. Everything had been carefully planned. Then reality walked onto the course on four legs. I arrived shortly after 9 o'clock to coordinate recovery efforts with several ranch hands. The air smelled like wet grass and fresh coffee drifting from the clubhouse patio. Everywhere I looked, people were holding phones. Recording. Photographing. Sharing. Some residents appeared frustrated. Others seemed amused. A few looked like they were trying very hard not to laugh. The cattle themselves remained remarkably calm. They wandered between fairways, explored landscaped areas, and investigated every patch of green grass that caught their attention. To them, it was simply another pasture. To Willow Creek, it was a disaster unfolding in front of an audience. Deborah spent most of the morning moving from group to group trying to regain control of the situation. Every time I saw her, she appeared more stressed than before. The confidence that had defined her during months of meetings and complaints was gone. In its place was the expression of someone realizing a plan had gone terribly wrong. Around 10 o'clock, I overheard one board member asking how the animals had reached the course. The question hung in the air for several seconds before anyone answered. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Because everyone already knew. The opening existed where the boundary fence had once stood. The same fence Deborah spent months trying to remove. The same fence contractors dismantled days earlier. The same fence that no longer separated a working ranch from a private golf course. What happened next made the situation even worse for the HOA. Several residents began posting older photographs online. Pictures showing the original fence. Pictures showing the property boundary. Pictures taken before the removal project. Then someone uploaded footage of construction vehicles operating along the eastern edge of the ranch. Suddenly the conversation shifted. People stopped asking why cattle were on the golf course. They started asking why the fence was gone. By lunchtime, that question was everywhere. Board members whispered among themselves. Residents demanded explanations. Sponsors quietly discussed leaving early. The tournament organizers eventually postponed several scheduled events because portions of the course were unavailable. Every delay generated more questions. Every question led back to the same decision. Meanwhile, my attorney called to inform me that additional documentation had been secured. Property surveys. County records. Contractor information. Everything connected perfectly. The facts were becoming impossible to ignore. Standing near the clubhouse, I watched as Deborah attempted to explain the situation to several frustrated homeowners. She pointed toward the fairways. She pointed toward the cattle. She pointed toward the ranch. What she could not point away from was responsibility. Because no matter how many explanations she offered, one fact remained unchanged. The cattle had not created the opening. The cattle had simply found it. And as more evidence surfaced throughout the day, the community began understanding something Deborah had failed to understand from the very beginning. Boundaries exist for a reason. Remove them carelessly, and eventually the consequences arrive exactly where you least expect them. The fallout continued long after the cattle were safely returned to the ranch. Within days, attorneys, insurance representatives, contractors, and county officials became involved. What had started as an argument about appearances was now a matter of documented property damage, unauthorized removal of private infrastructure, and a chain of consequences that could be traced with remarkable precision. Every piece of evidence pointed in the same direction. The security footage showed exactly who authorized the work. The survey reports established exactly where the property line existed. Contractor records confirmed exactly when the fence had been removed. Most importantly, every timeline matched perfectly. The opening appeared. The boundary disappeared. The cattle found access. There was very little room left for debate. Deborah spent several weeks attempting to shift responsibility elsewhere. First, she suggested the contractors misunderstood instructions. Then she implied that the property line had been unclear. Later, she claimed the situation resulted from a series of unfortunate misunderstandings. The problem with those explanations was that the documents told a different story. Facts tend to be stubborn that way. During one meeting, county officials reviewed the survey records that had already been verified multiple times. Watching that conversation unfold felt strangely familiar. For months, Deborah had treated legal boundaries as obstacles she could negotiate away. Now those same boundaries were being explained back to her by people whose job was enforcing them. The HOA eventually approved a settlement process that covered the costs associated with replacing the damaged fencing, restoring affected areas of the ranch, and resolving the disputes created by the unauthorized work. Insurance companies became involved as well, although not in the way Deborah had hoped. Several decisions made before the fence removal attracted considerable attention from investigators reviewing the timeline. By the end of the process, the financial consequences were significant. Residents who had once supported the project began asking difficult questions. Why had official surveys been ignored? Why had private property been treated as community space? Why had so many warnings been dismissed? Those questions became impossible to avoid. Several months later, Willow Creek held a board election. Deborah was not re-elected. The community chose new leadership, and one of the first actions taken by the incoming board was improving communication with neighboring property owners. To their credit, they approached me directly. We had several honest conversations. No speeches. No demands. Just practical discussions about boundaries, maintenance, and mutual respect. It was probably the most productive relationship the ranch had ever had with the HOA. By early spring, a new fence stood along the eastern boundary. Stronger posts. Fresh wire. Clearly marked property lines. One evening, I parked my truck near the same stretch of pasture where so much of the story had unfolded. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the grass in shades of gold and orange. A light breeze moved across the field carrying the familiar scent of hay and earth. The cattle grazed peacefully behind the newly rebuilt fence. Everything looked exactly as it should have looked from the beginning. I stood there for a long time thinking about my grandfather's words. Good boundaries keep everyone happy. Back when I was a kid, I thought he was talking about livestock. Standing there that evening, I finally understood the lesson completely. Boundaries protect more than property. They protect relationships. They prevent unnecessary conflict. They remind people where their authority ends and someone else's rights begin. Deborah spent months believing that fence was standing in the way of progress. In reality, it had been protecting the very things she cared about most. The view never needed fixing. The boundary never needed moving. The only real problem was the belief that someone else's property existed to serve her plans. In the end, the fence was rebuilt, the ranch remained exactly where it had always been, and Willow Creek learned an expensive lesson. They thought the fence was keeping my cattle in. The truth was that it had been keeping their future out of trouble.